3 lists into the year and already anger has been showed and sides have been split. All 3 of those lists that have occurred so far are in links in the description box below, but now it's time for one that everybody looks forward to. Each and every year, ever since the start of this channel, this has been one of the most widely anticipated videos, and that's the top 10 worst metal albums of the year of which we're talking about. In this case, it's 2015. These have always housed some fringe line bands. However, you have to remember that this isn't something where we're necessarily speaking just of true metal or whatever your freaking differentiation is. This is one that's actually going full circle. One that includes both those that are on your supposed fringe line and those that are supposedly within the same and within the fold. You know, they're in the deep end of the pool. So let's start off 2015's list with a couple of honorable mentions. These are ones that would have made it if there weren't 10 that were in front of them. And the ones that I'm considering and talking about with this, Danzig's Skeletons, I didn't include that because it's a covers album for one. It wasn't very good, but at the same time, with it being a covers album, it really isn't too fair to include that on a list with bands that are making negative waves based off of original material. Operation Mindcrime's The Key is one that got a rating that actually put it right here on the border. However, I like the progress that this album is making by comparison to their first, Frequency Unknown, which is still one of the worst albums of all time. And plus, this is one where it could be the weak link of the trilogy of albums that is going to be surrounding it. There's 2 more albums that Operation Mindcrime will be delivering us. And also Long Live from PHEW. This was supposed to be their grand comeback, and it didn't feel much like a comeback. In fact, it just felt like PHEW's worst qualities were sort of frozen in time a little bit, and they kind of unearthed a little bit of their old flavor, but not nearly enough for this to be considered, acceptable. So with that being said, let's get on to the actual list. Let's talk about the actual bands that have composed the top 10 worst metal albums of 2015. And remember, in order for this to be on the list, I had to have reviewed it here in this calendar year. Number 10, we have Silence in the Snow by Trivium. This is one that was actually being flip-flopped with a couple of the honorable mentions because this is an album that just feels average to mediocre. Trivium is a band that I have been accused of hating ever since the very first time I've ever done a video on them, and really, to be perfectly blunt, aside from a little situation that I had to take care of, I was relatively fair to. This album just doesn't have enough real progression in order to feel like Trivium has turned the corner. They instead feel like they're frozen in time with whatever little, mediocre hole that they're in, and since they're still selling records, and since the fans are still eating it up like a fucking feeding frenzy, they're not opting to move very many mountains, and they're kind of happy with status quo. This was a disc that had a great opening single that really led a lot of people to feel that this was going to be a triumphant return, but instead was kind of bogged down by a lot of tracks that just went nowhere, and really the memorable tracks are not even really all of that worth re-investigating and re-listening to. Number 9, Coverkillernation with This Is No Fairy Tale. Now, to be perfectly honest, this is not necessarily 100% the band's fault. Some might say that it is, considering they're the ones that opted to go this direction with their sound, but they're trying to combine folklore and fairy tales alongside of a black metal type idea, and they're trying to use this symphonic approach and try to add this depth and density to it, and meanwhile also retain the original evil intention of a lot of these stories. And it's trying its best, but at times comes off as really corny, sometimes comes off as cheesy. One person expertly pointed out that since their primary language is Dutch, that the translation could actually be what causes that. But along the same lines, within their catalog, within their own catalog, this is one that just feels the weakest out of all of them. It does not have the necessary it factor in order to really feel like it's going to make a lot of punch and have a lot of memory. And to kind of prove that, I forgot about this album and had to actually go back through a lot of the stuff that I talked about and re-listen to it. And I was actually less impressed all these months later than I actually was in the video. So yeah, this one's just a dud, but I think this band has what it takes to come back from it and produce a really great album their next time out. Number 8, Forgotten Tomb, Hurt Yourselves and Those You Love. This hurts considering I recommend this band to people. I recommend them a lot, in fact, considering albums such as Negative Megalomania and Songs to Leave, Springtime Depression are just absolutely perfect examples of the fringe line of really like what people would call depressive black metal or suicidal black metal or whatever, but this is one that we talked about the corniness of the last album of This Is No Fairy Tale. This is one that is even worse. This is one where it seems like they try to take basic function of language and try to give it a negative spin in order to give it that necessary brutal factor, as opposed to truthfully letting their music and truthfully letting their compositional style do the talking. And this has been a problem that they've had for the past few albums, honestly. Really, Negative Megalomania and the album that followed it up are the last two true shining, shimmering memories of Forgotten Tombs discography. And this one is probably the one that may have the worst factor to it. It just does not have really much to offer. One or two tracks that are extremely competent and gives you kind of a taste of what Forgotten Tomb is about, but the glory days of their earliest, observations of their career are kind of long in their memory. This is one where the band needs to sort of look at themselves a little bit and remember what they were good at. Number 7, we have Goliathan from Weed Eater, and this will surprise some. Many people love Weed Eater. I myself did as well. I love Jason the Dragon, fantastic disc, but the Goliathan, this is one that felt almost, and it felt unfinished, like there were tracks on this disc that just cut off abruptly and didn't have very much to offer within their short duration. It's a short release. It's one that doesn't take much time and just didn't bear a lot of recallance. It's not one that has much to offer. It's instead really a very unworthy follow-up to Jason the Dragon. It just doesn't have very much in its tank, not a lot of gas, and this is one where other groups he could easily move past Weed Eater in this department, in this like stoner metal or like this sludge metal department. They could quickly ascend the ranks and kind of leave Weed Eater in the dust. They really need to come back with their next release very, very strong, or else this is going to become a group that's just saddled to one great classic disc and the rest of them just sort of being there. Number 6, we have We Came as Romans with their self-titled album. Many people are probably going to be like, oh, so typical. You need to face facts. This was just a boring, bland, mediocre disc. It's one that even the fans of this band are saying really sort of turned their backs a little bit on what made some of their first initial albums such powerful, powerful tools that really got them into heavier or aggressive music, seeming like they have sort of turned away from that a bit in order to try to graze a little bit more toward conventional music. Conventionality? Yeah. Blah. Fuck outtakes. This is just a disc that didn't have a lot of strength behind it. It pulled a lot of punches and didn't respond with something that was brazen or a little bit creative or a shock factor right across or around the next corner. It's instead one that felt very comfortable within its little hole or within its little cage, and that hurts it magnificently in this regard. Number 5, we have All That Remains with the Order of Things. And this is one that almost was a little bit higher on the list, considering it was given a 70 out of 100 whenever it was initially reviewed, and it has only gone down in score in my mind ever since. This is a disc that is a trial to listen to. It's just not all of that enjoyable whatsoever. It takes some of the core ideas of All That Remains. It takes the idea that they've transcended metal. They're trying to do this thing where they are once again sort of bleeding the lines of conventionality. They're trying to tread the grass of what All That Remains is about, and then this like sort of arena rock, hard rock approach, and they're trying to do this and that. They're trying to do a lot of things here, and that's respectable. It's respectable that they are attempting some of these things, but the problem is that they're not attempting them very well. They did not really do this experiment very well. It's instead one where if this is the remainder of All That Remains' career, if this is what they're aiming for, then they are going to consistently and constantly find themselves on lists like this. This stuff feels dull. It feels not very creatively sparked. It does not have a lot of power behind it. As much power as they think they're sinking into these tracks with taglines and lyrics, it isn't getting through. It is not getting through. The ideas feel trite, they feel monotonous, and they feel like they have been assaulted and barraged in our faces 10,000 times before, so thus the uniquity of it goes out the window. Nothing unique about this. It's a piece of shit. Number 4, I wrestled a bear once with Hail Mary. This was a clusterfuck of a disc that tried to do a lot of different things. It's instead one that really falls flat on all levels in that regard, considering it's... these guys are a band of the mathcore variety that are trying to maybe step outside the circle a little bit. And you're noticing that a lot of groups on this list attempted to step outside the circle. They sort of took that risk, similar to what people say Megadeth did with Risk, as a really good counterpoint. And it just didn't give the same, it didn't elicit the same response or the same reaction. This is a band whose discography has just famously not been very much my thing, but trying my best to really give this a competent listen was a struggle. And giving it 5 to 6 to even on upward to 10 listens, and not being able to get through the whole thing without having to just, step away or just, really take a breath, that's not a very good thing, as you're going to learn with the top 15 best rock/pop albums of all time, or rap, or the top 50 heavy metal albums of the year. These are discs that are able to be enjoyed and loved in one sitting, and that's what you need. An album from a band where you need to step away, where you need to breathe, where you cannot do that in one setting, especially whenever it's like in the 40-minute range, it's not a very long release, that's a problem. That's a huge problem, and that's one that this suffered from big time. Number 3 is Bring Me the Horizon with That's the Spirit. Now, think about everything I just said in number 4. The first listen through That's the Spirit was one that had that same struggle attached to it. This is instead, though, an album that with each subsequent listen became a little bit more attuned to listen to all the way through. However, the problem with it is that even with those subsequent listens, it still didn't get any more enjoyable anywhere along the way. This is another group that opted to experiment. And once again, give them credit for that. This is the one that was deciding to experiment a little bit more with electro music, a little bit more with perhaps club music, trying to infuse metal in with that a little bit. And this is one that confused a lot of people. This is one where a lot of fans were questioning what this really was meant to be, what this was stating for Bring Me the Horizon. And here's kind of how I feel about this. I'm probably wrong about this, and I don't care. This is just what it sounds like. Bring Me the Horizon, with their last album, which was excellent, Sempiternal, was a band that was trying to bridge some gaps. It was one that was trying to remove themselves from the conventionalities of deathcore and metalcore and tried to forge their own path, and then attempted to do it again here. But with That's the Spirit, it feels like they were listening to a lot of the songs that were starting to get big, and they noticed that they were these sort of club anthems that had this kind of softer tone to it, and decided, you know what, everyone's going fucking apeshit about this. We need to get on board this little paddy wagon, and that's exactly what they did. It feels as though Bring Me the Horizon is following the herd. That's one of the biggest objectable slaps in the face that a lot of people really aren't talking about, but probably should. You need to take a look at this and realize that they essentially just looked at convention, looked at what was doing well, looked at what most now that's what I call musics are filled with in 2015, and walked along those lines, and actually opted to walk down that line. That being said, this is not an album that from head to toe is awful or boring. We're going to get in 2 of those at number 1 and number 2. This is instead an album that just didn't feel like it had much of anything to offer. It felt just like it hovered in existence, and that was it. It's unclear whether or not this is going to be the remainder of their career, or if this is just a one-off experiment. I'm hoping for the latter, because I enjoyed the direction that they were going with Sempiternal, but it's not my band. Then we get to number 2. Five Finger Death Punch with Got Your Six. You probably thought this was going to be number 1, and guess what? I did too. I thought this was going to be number 1 all the way up until the point in which I started list construction, and then all of a sudden, as I was reviewing the year and going back in time, basically reliving the past 12 months of my life, which not necessarily was a good thing, I realized that Five Finger Death Punch could not be the number 1 worst album of 2015. That there was one that was actually worse. But we're going to talk about Got Your Six and try to soldier our way through this. This is one that barely got a 60 out of 100. and really it's one that, with subsequent listens, it doesn't get a 60 out of 100. The songwriting on this album is still the one thing that Five Finger Death Punch has left. At times they have the ability to be semi-competent songwriters, ones that are able to initiate a little bit of literal punch into their music and give it a little bit of life. That being said, their lyricism has nosedived and tanked to levels that are absurd. Boots and Blood, as we mentioned in the top 10 worst songs of 2015, is a track that will live in infamy. It's going to be one that will be remembered in years to come, not just by coverkillernation fans, not just by people who peruse this channel once and then leave, but it's going to be one that's going to be remembered by many people. Considering the lyrics to this track and the overall composition of this track was just so abominable that it bears that sort of tragic memory. It's going to be listed along albums such as, Frequency Unknown by Operation Mindcrime, either that or maybe even A Lud Divinium Insanus. This is an album that might actually be right there par for the course whenever it comes to those other two, but there's actually one that may eclipse some of them. Okay, let's not talk crazy here. Five Finger Death Punch has been on this radical decline for a long time now. It's getting to the point that their 7th album might as well just be called Seventh Heaven, and they might as well just construct theme music for the show that is no longer on television. But that brings us to number 1. You might be thinking to yourself, if Five Finger Death Punch is not number 1, what the fuck is? Well, I'm going to answer that question for you. 6 Feet Under's Crypt of the Undead. This is the album, that got the worst score in Cover Killer Nation history here in 2015. A 45 out of 100. A death metal band. A band that is within the supposed deep end of heavy metal. A Chris Barnes project. What the fuck happened here? I'll tell you exactly what the fuck happened here. This bland piece of garbage, this album right in typicality, this is one that basically you would think the idea would be to attempt to revive the idea of classic death metal. And we're talking death metal from the first portion of the 1990s. And considering how much we hover around the past and talk about it, you would think this would be an idea well received by individuals such as this. But then you start to remember. You start to remember that in the 90s, whenever these albums came out, they had something. They had an it factor. They had an oomph factor. They didn't feel forced. They didn't feel like the band was just trying to recycle ideas that the bands from the 90s were doing, and then essentially tried to recycle the whole mess. And this was a botched recycling. This is almost like a back alley abortion that's being performed by a 12-year-old with a gun to its head. It's that bad. Overall, this album has only 3 potential uses. Coaster, Frisbee, something that you would get your worst enemy as a gift. Those are the only 3 things that I could think that you could use this for. You could shove this up your ass, but that would be punishment to you. So if you're into that sort of thing, have at it. But if you're actually, considering a purchase of this album, if you actually think that 6 Feet Under can do no wrong and Crypt of the Undead is a perfect album, you might want to call your local psychic hotline with your tinfoil hat on and discuss with Madam Bitchface on how you're going to marry a porn star within the next 24 hours because you're fucking loco in the cabeza. You are psycho, you're so far beyond rational thought that it's absurd to think that you're alive. It really is absurd to think that you still breathe among us, because how you can do that, how you are still that high functioning, yet believe that Crypt of the Undead is a competent album, let alone a good one, is beyond words. You are perhaps an alien. This is one of the most boring albums, one of the worst albums. You want to talk about albums where it was a struggle to get through, and this thing was not long. This was like a 34-minute investment of your time. This is like a television show episode plus 5 minutes of extra, like extra fucking outtakes. And it was awful. It was a horrible experience. It was one that I put out of my mind, clearly for a reason, but had to revisit and had to remember for this very list. Because it is 2015's worst album of the year in the heavy metal department. There you have it. 10 abortions that didn't happen. 10 reasons why in music sometimes being pro-life is a bad choice. We'll no doubt do this again next year. We'll no doubt have a lot of the same bands to talk about, and the same variety. Some people may complain that this seems to happen all the time with some of these bands, but that's the problem. The thing of it is that, in purest of explanation, these are groups that this should be a wake-up call. It should be a wake-up call to tell them that perhaps the formula, which may seem easy, which may seem simple, and which may sell records, may not be what music or what heavy metal is all about. Instead, this is something that's just bland, or in the case of some macho, butch, tough guy metal that has this appeal of like 15 people, truthfully, and the rest of them are just along for the fucking ride. Always fun, never pleasant. Do you agree or do you disagree? Post your list of the 10 worst albums of 2015 in the comments box below. And post your defenses if you thought that any of the albums on this list were not worthy of being on it. Thank you very much. My name is coverkillernation, and I eagerly await your letters and your responses. With a smile on my face. A little shit-eating grin. Fuckers.